The KBD75 version 2 is a solid and popular choice for custom builds. Its 75% layout has it so the buyer doesn't sacrifice any keys, unlike a 60% or 65% layout, and it still keeps a fairly compact form factor to leave plenty of space on your desk. This board is usually readily available on kbdfans.com, and that availability can't be said for most custom builds. In this video, I'm going to take you through my build process for this board. Upon opening the box, you'll see the brushed aluminum plate, followed by the PCB, then the nicely wrapped case to avoid any scratches. Finally, there are the stabilizers and some screws. The first thing to do after unwrapping the case would be to stick on the included rubber feet to avoid damage. Once that is done, we can flip it over and start unscrewing to see what we're working with. The bottom weight is the first thing that comes off. There's an option to upgrade it to brass for about $20 more, but this one is the stock aluminum. Next is the base and top plate with the frosted acrylic piece between them. The bottom of the board has a classic yet unique design that I find quite clean and attractive. Before the building process starts, you first want to test your PCB, which is essentially the soul of the keyboard. If it doesn't work properly, you'd have wasted your time building a faulty or even unusable board. Start by opening up a keyboard tester website after plugging in your PCB. You then want to use metal tweezers to touch the two metal holes corresponding to each key to test to see if it works. If it registers on the tester, then you're good to go. Up next, we have arguably the most important part of the keyboard, being the switches. They're what you feel when you interact with the board, and going with the custom build gives you a plethora of switch options to choose from. These here are Gateron Milky Blacks, and to do them justice, lubing them is a must for me. I used a switch opener, but you can use anything sharp, like a screwdriver or even your fingers to pry these switches open. I separated each part into 4 bowls to make the lubing process a little bit easier. Once everything is separated, we can proceed to individually apply lubricant to each switch, which is as tedious as it sounds. I chose to use a slightly thick, buttery lube called Krytox 205 grade 0.5, which ended up working really well, I thought. I first brushed lube onto the inner walls of the switch, being sure to apply it evenly for consistency when typing in the future. Lubing each switch should make the typing experience much smoother to the touch and much more pleasant to the ear. Once that's done, lube the tips of your spring, then the sides of one of the middle stems. Put the parts back into the lubed bottom housing before snapping the switch back together with its top housing. And there you have one completely lubed switch. Rinse and repeat this process for the rest of it, and then you should have a complete set of lubed switches. Here's a quick sound test to show you the difference between a lubed and an unlubed switch. Now that the long and draining process of lubing all of our switches is over, we can move on to the stabilizers. In this case, I'm using the stock clip-on stabilizers, but GMK screw-ins are usually best. To mod them, in order to lower the rattle, you must take them apart, and you guessed it, lube them up. You want to lube up the sides and the wire to reduce the rattle. Here's a quick sound comparison of a lube stabilizer versus an unlubed stabilizer. Now the last thing to do to soften the sound of these stabs would be to band-aid mod them. This means cutting a small square from a band-aid or fabric tape and applying that square to where the stabilizer would hit the PCB in order to dampen the harsh sound of the stabilizer. This would also somewhat protect the PCB from repetitive banging of the stabilizer against it. Once that's done, it's time for the daunting task of soldering in the switches. This was my first time soldering, and if I can do it, then anyone can do it. The way I did it was first by snapping in the switches to the corners and to the stabilizers to level out the aluminum plate. From there, after getting used to the soldering feel, it was actually quite relaxing, and I highly recommend people learning this skill if they want to build a keyboard, because it's not too difficult to pick up, and it's useful. And with that, we have a beautifully soldered PCB. It's definitely not perfect, but I am proud of myself, and I'm definitely pleased with how it turned out. And now the real fun begins. I'd already put the keycaps on the switches to make sure everything fit before assembling it all together. First thing to go back onto the keyboard is the weight. From there, we can flip the case and squeeze in the case foam that I'd cut for the acoustics of the board. After that comes the extremely satisfying task of unpeeling the frosted acrylic layer, which fits perfectly over the foam. Then, place on the PCB end plate and screw it all in. Once that's done, we can put the top plate on and screw the keyboard all together. And with that, we have our gorgeous KBD75 version 2. The keyboard itself comes in at about 13 inches wide by 5 inches deep. Very compact, yet it includes function keys and arrow keys with its 75% form factor, which is really convenient. It's without question a solid board, coming in at 3 pounds, 2.8 ounces, and that weight gives the board such a premium feel, it's amazing. And now for the long-awaited sound test. This board has Gateron Milky blacks, which are a medium to slightly heavy linear switch with a typical 4mm travel distance, actuating at 60 grams of force and bottoming out around 70 grams. I love the thocky sound the PBT keycaps provide, and I'm not too bothered by the stabs, though screw-ins definitely would have been better. Overall, this is a custom keyboard, so it's not going to be cheap. I managed to get this build to just around $250. But you can spend as much as $800 just sprucing this board up. This was my first build of many, so it was by no means perfect, but I learned a lot and I'm very pleased with how this build turned out overall.